Welcome to the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast, a show dedicated to modern learning and development. With your hosts, Daniel Mendonca and Scott Babcock.
It's podcast day. Welcome to the show. This is If You Build It, Will They Learn? I'm Scott Babcock, and with me as always is your co-host, Daniel Mendonca. Daniel, how is June treating you so far?
June's treating me pretty good. I would say today it's not the first official day of summer, but I walked outside this morning and it is hot and humid. I know you've been dealing with that since like January in Nashville, but for Windsor, it is hot and humid and it feels like summer is finally here.
I love that. It's been that way here for a while, so I'm glad the rest of the world is catching up on the weather front at least a little bit. So, yeah, things are hot and humid and muggy here in Nashville, but that's just kind of how we live our lives for a good chunk out of the year. So, all right, on the show today, we are going to be talking about learning styles. We want to talk about sort of the research, the myths, possibly debunking some of the thoughts that may exist out there, and really cover off on what is it and kind of help guide maybe your decision around how you might be able to implement that into your strategy moving forward. All right. Always best to start at the beginning when we talk about any of these topics. So maybe let's talk about what's often referred to as the Vark model, V-A-R-K. And it kind of refers to all the different learning styles that are sort of recognized out there. And then we can kind of talk through the way we see those and how we maybe see some of those coming to light. Let's start with number one, which is a visual learner. We can think see it on this. When we kind of look at this as a learning style or preference, these folks learn best through graphics such as charts, graphic organizers, patterns, shapes, and other visual aids. It's important to note that they do not learn through just still pictures, but rather symbols, patterns, and often this helps them retain information. All right, so there's the sort of dictionary definition of a visual learner. Daniel, any thoughts on maybe places where you see some of this coming to life in our content?
Yeah, I think there's been a big trend over the past little while of infographics, motion graphics, animations, things of that sort that has really been used to depict information in small bite-sized chunks if we go back to microlearning. So I think those are all big parts of visual learners that I love to, we'll jump into more a little bit later. All right, next is auditory learners, Scott. And these are individuals who learn by lecture style conversation, podcasts, basically just listening in general or hearing people tell them or say certain information. It's really going to broaden a range of different ways that you can engage with content depending on who you're with. But do you have any thoughts on the auditory learner, Scott, and kind of how it relates to our content?
There's always sort of been a thought in learning around like repetition being part of retention or memorization. I think that's important for an auditory learner, right, to hear it multiple times over and over. And I think in the spoken word, that's much easier and kind of feels less redundant than text. So it's a really easy way to apply that. All right, our third one is reading and writing learners. Think write it. The easiest way to sort of describe this group is folks that actually prefer to read and then take notes. So it's sort of a combination deal for those folks. They like to read it in a textbook, but they also like to write it down and then reread it. So again, repetition matters, but they often find their own writing to be part of the memorization process or retention process for them as well. So they prefer essays, taking notes, and then again, reading in textbooks and kind of absorbing it through that material as well. So
yeah, I kind of think into if you go back to university, and taking notes on whether they're flashcards or Post-its or just writing in your notebook when you highlight things or whatever. I think that's one of the most common ways university students learn when you think about education. I definitely fall into this category, but I think it's a proponent to kind of putting it all together. And then lastly, within the Vark model, kinesthetic. So think do it. These learners are people who learn best with the tactile process, being able to actually be practical with what they're doing, whether it's a certain action, a certain process where they really want to carry it out rather than, listening or seeing or writing. They want to jump in maybe head first and do something. And that's how they learn and adjust best.
Absolutely. And this for me is, I think it's where we tend to focus a lot, is give you some information and then let you start to practice. And perhaps that's more because of the way we apply this to a job, or we work with a lot of corporations to try to help them make their folks behave differently. But really, like, this is an important one for a lot of folks because they're going to be practicing something they're being employed to do. So I think it's really valuable as you talk through that as a way to look at it. I think it's important to note that as we talk through these, the reality is you probably resonate with one or two or three or even all four of them, and you're often able to learn through a combination of this, right? So we'll talk more about that as we go through this. And a lot of times, one of these styles is going to be dictated a lot by the content. So, what exactly are you trying to do? We can talk through more of that as we move along. But this is sort of a controversial topic in the world of learning and development for most companies and organizations, and even academically, is, do these really exist? Is it really something that you should be focusing on as a learner? And we want to dive into that as well. So without further ado, we're going to talk about some of the research. All right. So again, I mentioned this is sort of controversial in a lot of ways. What is out there in terms of research? Are learning styles a real thing? We talked about, are there myths? Do we need to debunk some of those? And I think it's important to kind of recognize that there's two sort of schools of thought. One is that learning styles as a whole don't really exist. There's no strategic advantage as a educator, facilitator, trainer to apply the concept of learning styles to your learners. And the other side says that there is still learning style value, that people do tend to resonate or adhere to a learning style in their own mind, if nothing else. So I want to talk through some of those. And as we look at some of the research, just I'd encourage us, as we go through this, keep an open mind for starters, and then we'll talk through some of those implications as well as we move forward. But generally, we'll start on sort of the anti-learning style concept or model, and we'll talk through what that means. But generally, studies have found that there's little to no significant scientific evidence that teaching to a learning style specifically has any great impact in terms of retention or better performance. So what does that mean? So in 2012, there was a study that showed that 80% of UK and Netherlands teachers believe that learners still perform better when taught in their preferred learning style. And then a 2017 poll showed that, again in the UK, found that 85% believed in learning styles and 66% still use them in their schools. So what we're seeing is that facilitators still believe that it's a thing. They're still applying it, but they're not getting the value according to the scientific research. So one of the key points to that is to note that when researchers are doing this, they're saying, I'm going to talk to Daniel. We're going to do an assessment of Daniel. I'm going to learn he's a kinesthetic learner, and then I'm only going to teach him in kinesthetic style, right? And then I might talk to Sally and say, oh, she's a reader writer. I'm only going to teach her in that style. And there's this very distinct line that teachers are drawing saying that that's how they're going to teach. So what we're learning is that doesn't work. And I think that's an important distinction when we talk about learning styles and why they maybe aren't working, because I do think people are diverse. We talked about the fact that you're probably a combination, and just teaching you in one style doesn't have the value according to the scientific research.
Yeah, I think that a lot of that's really valuable, and it's interesting to kind of dissect. One of the things that I'm just going to go back to kind of my previous experience from education perspective of studying and throughout university and whatever other education I've gone through. It really comes down to what you're most comfortable with. So I think that stating that somebody's a kinesthetic learner, they may be most comfortable there, but really if they were taught how to learn from a reading writing perspective, or how to learn auditorially, or what they should be looking for, picking up on, I think that's where you get back to the general study from a scientific perspective of there is no significant gain by narrowing down in one place. I think just people are comfortable, so they tend to retain the way they're most comfortable. And I don't think that means it's necessarily a preferred, but just a place where they are most comfortable and maybe haven't learned how to learn in the other ways.
Well, and one of the things that's really called out in most of the studies that are kind of sort of, we'll call it anti-learning style for now, is that when you only say this is the way you're going to learn, it actually encourages students to not think creatively about learning or to problem solve. They become, to your point, very comfortable in a certain style or a certain delivery, and then they can't adjust when life throws them a curveball, because the reality is it's very hard to cater to four distinct learning styles, especially in a classroom. And so they can't adapt to another learning style or another delivery method. And so that, I think, is probably one of the greatest values of not adhering to a learning style delivery method adamantly is you're actually encouraging your students to help adapt and become more dynamic in the way they absorb content or their ability to perform in different environments. So I absolutely agree that that is probably the reality for a lot of students, is that it actually helps them to have to think outside the box a little bit, especially as they move forward in their careers. If you're talking more around like elementary or fundamental school education as opposed to maybe corporate training. With that in mind, you mentioned preference, and that's actually, I think, an important distinction here. We may prefer to learn in a certain style as opposed to having to learn in a certain style, right? Is it mandated versus, or do you prefer it? I, for one, and we'll talk about this a little later, struggle with like a lecture style environment. It's not where I already know I have a gap there, right? So as we talk about some of this other research, that's really what we're talking about is, the science says facilitators shouldn't focus on a particular style, but most of it actually says that students tend to find value in knowing their learning style and trying to adapt and understand that better. So as we talk about some of the research on the kind of pro learning style side, Kansas State University actually still has it up on their biology page, a Vark Model assessment. So if you're going through as a biology student at Kansas State University, they actually encourage you to think about the option of assessing yourself on your learning style preference. One of the things that's interesting about that is they don't mandate it. It's not requirement of going through that program. But when they've done their studies, those individuals who've been a part at early fundamental 101 style classes in that biology department, they tend to produce a full letter grade higher scores than individuals who transfer in later and haven't gone through that assessment model. And they actually indicate that it is less about dictating how to be taught, but rather that the student understands the best way to get information. They understand how they're best going to approach thinking about the content. So they're better studiers. To your point, Daniel, I think you mentioned the ability to kind of train your brain to think differently. Students are able to apply that when they're going to get information or the way they approach their studies. I think that maybe has value, right? So likewise, just on top of that really quick, I'll go through the last two here that we have. About 90% of students during a recent study of the University of Virginia believe they have a learning style. So again, students are identifying that they have a preference, that there is a gap when they look at something else. And then Richard Felder, who's a professor emeritus at North Carolina State University, has written pretty extensively about debunking the defined learning styles in those studies as being too black and white. That again, they're sort of designing those studies to debunk them ahead of time. And I think that's kind of what we talked about in, would we ever see a class just teach to one learning style? Probably not. And it is probably more about blending. And that's really his approach, is that there's value in doing both sides.
Yeah, Scott, on that point, I want to hop into the blended component of all of this. I think that, this kind of goes back to the research as well, but there's some studies that have shown about how you can combine different learning styles. We use a learning philosophy of tell me, show me, let me do. And that's based off the studies that learners tend to retain about 10% of information after 90 days when they're just told it. They retain about 25% after 90 days when they've been told it and shown it, and they retain about 65% of information when they've been told it, shown it, and they're able to actually apply it and do it. And that's from a study by Harris and Blackmore back in 2009. And I think that's really a great place to start the conversation of around learning styles and how it relates to any sort of learning development, whether it's corporate, whether it's athletics and coaching, whether it's education. Combining as many different learning types as possible is great, because then you can trigger, number one, the preference of the learner, but number two, also maybe activate some types of learning or comfortability with learning that they maybe didn't know they had, and also give them different perspectives. So I think that blended approach is something that's very important kind of when you're talking about learning styles.
Yeah, and I struggle with some of the research itself, just because I do think it focuses solely on like one type of delivery, right? And you're sort of saying, number one, you have to spend the time to predefine for a learner what you are, and that takes time in a classroom, and then to try to dictate that solely is probably counterproductive. I'm absolutely in alignment with that. But I think you're going to reach the greatest number of learners, the greatest amount of your audience by trying to blend and get more diverse in some of your content. And with that, you may trigger them to be more interested in the styles that they don't maybe adhere to or identify with as well. For me, I know I'm a kinesthetic learner. I don't do well sitting in a classroom. I never have. I don't like listening and then trying to take notes. I'll lose it almost every time. And what I end up having to do is double learn everything in a lot of ways. So I will sit in that lecture for an hour or 2 hours or whatever the class might be. I'm watching the PowerPoints come in. I'm trying to take screenshots or type my notes or whatever. And ultimately, I'm going back after the class and I'm looking up YouTube videos that let me practice, right? So I can watch somebody do it and then I can go do whatever it is. I'm going to go practice on my own by trying to explore that in another avenue. And ultimately, that I think probably is where some of the science falls apart is we're testing these folks saying, oh, if I only teach you this way, but even if it doesn't land, you don't know what they're doing outside of the study to go get the information if they're really passionate about it. So for me, I think it's probably about trying to provide as many avenues for the learner to get the information the way they want to get it, because there is probably a preference from a learner's perspective. And we'll talk about how this can be put back into your organization from a practice perspective. But I think diversity, that blended approach, is probably always going to benefit you in terms of being successful in the way you approach it. And I also understand that, look, our podcasts, there's a lot of repetition here, right? Hopefully that lands that message. You're going to hear things like blended learning, clear objectives. I don't think that's speaking to anything really groundbreaking or brand new, but it really is important. It's going to keep coming up no matter what we talk about. So keep that in mind as well, that a blended approach is probably always best.
Yeah, on that note, I think that like I look back at any time where I am today versus where I was in university, and it used to drive me crazy because I'll self admit that I wasn't a good studier or test taker or retainer of information. Maybe that's because I didn't want to do it, but who knows? But I had some classmates who would never come to class, and then they'd be a 95% average student because them sitting in a lecture had absolutely positively no value to them. Off of what you said, Scott, they would read the textbook themselves. They would take their own notes, and they could do more. And I remember a situation where they were debating with our professor because they lost their participation mark based upon attendance, but they had the highest mark in the class. If they wouldn't have been taken away from them, and I think that goes back to maybe comfortability or what the preferred method is, but they truly believe that there was no value of them sitting through a lecture, where I would much rather prefer hearing a professor or a trainer or an instructor give me an instruction and take that in and listen, and I'm able to remember it and give that information back when needed if I'm listening to it. So I think that's where it is. There is a huge differentiator, and I think it really comes down to preference. So maybe it's not a necessity, but understanding and being flexible to your learners' preferences may be your best approach.
And I do think there is a difference, just so we're kind of defining, because I think it matters, but we're speaking a lot to either the university experience or the educational system. And there has been, and I say this recently, realizing I get old and I forget exactly how old I am. So I don't think it's actually that recent, right? It's been a while since I went to university, but I did better. I performed better in classes that I could take online because they were self-paced. I could do it the way I wanted to do it. If I wanted to sit and watch the lecture, I could. If I wanted to go just browse the internet trying to look for the right information, whether I wanted to practice on my own, I had control as a learner. And so in that sense, I like to think of myself as a pioneer of modern learning today, where that is what people want, right? They want more control in their abilities to get the information and to kind of guide their study. And maybe we can take that forward into more the professional world where you and I spend more of our time now. Things like e-learning probably have different value for folks today, and they may find more value in that because they have more control, because they can focus on the words, or they can focus on the images, or they could listen to video if it's incorporated. And then having things like instructor-led classes for those folks might not be as impactful. But again, as an organization, you're going to get to dictate how that happens a little bit more maybe than an educational program can. But keep that in mind when you're thinking about it. Maybe that diversity matters. All right. So as always, we've kind of covered off on a few topics here. The important thing, though, is how are you going to take this back? What are some real practices you might be able to put into play to really maximize on the ability to produce content for your learners, get the most out of them, have the most diverse or the most impact with them as well. So I'll just start with the first one. I think we've probably beat it a little bit, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but diversify your modalities. You're going to reach the broadest audience by doing that blended approach, by spending the right amount of time, keeping it diverse, not focusing too much on one particular delivery method. And if we think of the delivery method again as learning style, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't just have e-learning, but think about the way the content is structured within the e-learning. Is it text heavy? Is it video based? Is it have a lot of animation? Is it auditory? Does it allow for a lot of click interaction? All of those are abilities to reach different learning styles and potentially could even be in one singular course. But keep that diverse. Think about other options for delivery, whether that's we've talked about like PDF documentation. Is it more of a YouTube instructional video style? Should you still have instructional classes? Does that make sense? You're going to reach the broadest audience by having options.
Yeah, I think the modality, going back to choosing modality, I think is great. When we talk to our customers, we always say, in a perfect world, every topic or objectives that you want to train on would have a virtual instructor-led training, so you can talk to people, have some sort of webinar. I didn't say instructor-led because that would be extremely expensive, but so instructor-led or virtual instructor-led, an e-learning to allow someone to self-pace, some sort of video about the topic, an auditory component. So that could be the video, or there could be an MP3 or a podcast attached to it, and a resource document to take away that they could read, highlight, write out. Now, budget gets sprinkled in there, and that's not possible. So you have to optimize the modality you're looking to choose. But when you take it back, being able to offer training on a specific topic in as many of these learning styles as possible is beneficial to the retention for your audience. It's going to hit on the repetition, like we talked about. It's going to hit on the different learning styles, like we talked about. It's going to give you you're going to be able to cast a wide net to your learners and allow them to kind of go down that personalized journey that we've talked about before in a way that they feel most comfortable.
With that in mind, as you're talking about the learners themselves, like spend time, get feedback, right? That'll be my second point here is talk to your learners, find out what they like, what they dislike, help them guide you, right? I think that's a simple take back. Do surveys, look at the ratings on your LMS, feedback surveys that are coming from your content, whatever that might be. Learn from them, let them help guide you. I think that's a good second takeaway that's probably pretty straightforward. I said it and I like it, and I think it matters. If you've always done something in a particular format, whether you're a classroom environment or whether you're doing e-learning, explore, try something new, see if it lands. I think more offerings, again, it's diversifying, but think outside the box. Are you the next podcaster for learning and development? Is that something your organization wants to take on? And some of this obviously comes down to, Daniel mentioned it, but what do your resources even look like? Can you take on that? Do you have someone who has the time? Do you have someone who has the experience? Do you have the space, the interest, all of that? So, but explore. I think it's cool.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to touch on, because it wouldn't be a podcast with me on it if I didn't mention me coaching soccer. So it's I think this is pretty transferable across to organizational learning and development as well. Is as your culture of learning or culture of development with your employees or your audience grows, the comfort of the way they're able to learn with you also grows as well. So I'll give you an example. I coach at a university, so I have players anywhere from 1 year to 4 or 5 years where I'm coaching them. In year 4 or 5, it's very easy for me to verbalize something to them and to them to understand what they need to do and take it in and be able to do whatever I've asked. Where when someone is new and don't necessarily understand the method or my philosophy or those sorts of things, I need to explain it to them, show it to them, and allow them to rehearse it in more cases to then have success. So I have to hit on a variety of different learning types in order for them to engage it and retain it, rather than people who maybe are more comfortable with you from a philosophy perspective. And that's really, I think, important to understand, that if you have somebody who's comfortable and you understand the way they're talking, maybe listening is just okay, or maybe reading is just okay. So that comfort of the trainer is, I think, is a big part of this as well.
Yeah, you mentioned practice or training yourself to think differently or whatever, and that probably even happens throughout the life cycle of your employee or your learner. As they get more and more comfortable with your content, they're going to see familiarity with it, and to your point, they may even change the way they're receptive to that content over time. My next point on this is, and this is really critical, is you have to let the topic and the message of your content guide your choice of modality. The reality is not everything fits into a classroom environment. Not everything is going to fit into an e-learning from a strategic perspective. Not necessarily you couldn't get it there, but that might not make sense. So don't feel too married to having to get something into video or into an e-learning content. Or a workshop or whatever. Make sure you're really letting the content guide your modality. That's probably going to have more impact on the success of it than trying to force feed a learning style back to a learner. And then lastly, and this I see a ton from a client perspective, it probably is kind of taking all of this together, is don't assume on behalf of your audience. I talk to a lot of clients who say, my learners don't do this, or my learners can't be in a mobile environment. They don't know how to use the technology, or they can't access it, or they don't have the data plans or whatever. And Daniel and I do this as we talk quite a bit. He can probably back me up on the thought here, but we hear that a lot. And then just a little bit of diving deeper, or we say, let's just try it and run it out. And by the time you do it, you find out, oh, wow, all of those assumptions are wrong in general. It's very easy to make the assumption. Maybe it's based on history, what happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever, and assume that times haven't changed. But just be sure you're actually touching base again. Don't assume on behalf of your audience that they can't do something a certain way, or that they don't want to do something a certain way, because often that just doesn't hold water for a lot of organizations that we talk to.
Yeah, I think that's probably, and we've definitely discussed this on past podcasts, but I think this is probably the biggest thing we see in conversations with our customers is, and for us as a service provider, I think it's difficult because we have essentially two customers. We have the customer that we're serving, and then their learner, who's actually the customer of this whole process. And having their opinion and not putting words in their mouth, or not just, how they prefer to learn, is super important. So I think having that conversation will help you guide that conversation to modality and style.
Come on, get happy.
All right. As with every show, we like to end it on a positive note, something from the world that gets us excited, gives us some energy. Mine is sort of a conglomeration of the last 3, 4, or 5 weeks. I have now cooked, so I like barbecuing, I like being outside, but I have now smoked 3 briskets, a meat style that has been the bane of my existence as someone who likes to smoke meats. I figured out pulled pork pretty early. I like doing turkey. I like doing chicken, sausages, pork chops, all of that. The brisket was always my holy grail, and I sit and I watch the YouTube videos. I've trained myself in all the things we're talking about, the different styles, and I nailed it. So we're actually getting it down. So I've done 3 of them in the last few weeks. They're so popular. By popular demand, we keep eating it. So all of the neighbors are loving it. And the reality is, in this case, more than anything else, I was getting it way too complex, trying to be too cute, fancy, gourmet chef with the seasonings and the timing and everything else. It was super, just take it back to basics was basically what I learned. And to be honest with you, so that has been really cool and it's been fun. There's nothing better in the world than if you like to cook, then you make food and people seem to actually enjoy it and they keep coming back for more. So while my wife is now burnt out completely on brisket and we may not make another one for a year, it's been cool to have that happen. Plus it gave us an opportunity to share with the neighbors and have some interaction and get some social component to the world, which we all get together for food, right? It's kind of a common unifying factor. So anyway, for me, it's been the fact that I figured out how to make brisket in a good way, and it was delicious. So
well, I'm not sure you're allowed to wait a year, but whenever I'm allowed to cross the border again, which by the way seems like it's going to get extended,
probably.
Again. Whenever we're allowed to cross the border and I come back to Nashville, Scott, you're going to have to cook up some brisket for us.
There you go. Happy to do so.
So my positivity point, and I'm going to refer to my daughter like she's a Pokemon. My wife laughs every single time I say it. She's just growing and getting older. She's 4 months on Saturday, but she's evolving. So this past week, We're in like the 4-month leap, they call it. And she just all of a sudden wants to roll from back to front. She wants to squeal like she's a dolphin, as loud as possible. She's found different decibels in her lungs. It's just every few weeks this happens, but this has definitely been the largest change, where she's just becoming a little human who's got moods and attitude and sass. And she reminds me a lot of my wife in that regard. By the way, don't tell her I said that. Hopefully she doesn't listen. But yeah, no, she's just growing up so fast. And the fact that she's 4 months already, when she spent 3 of her 4 months in lockdown for the pandemic, but she's just growing up so fast, and it's been fantastic to see. And she just brings so much joy. So I could probably use Oakley, my daughter, as my positivity point every week. I choose not to and try to diversify, but maybe I'm going to bring her up a little more often.
She's absolutely adorable, and the pictures absolutely, her facial expressions, the sass is real. That's a thing, and she's got it in spades. So, but yeah, it is. You're hitting the age where life's going to change pretty drastically. I keep telling you, beware of when they start to move, because you as a parent, your entire world is going to evolve quite quickly in that sense. So,
well, even this morning, I fed her at 6 a.m. And then we were looking on the baby monitor about 5 minutes after I put her back down, and she was just on her stomach. And I was just like, oh, that's neat. Okay, perfect. And now she doesn't even like sitting up. She just, when we pull her hands to sit up, she just stands up now and just stands. And she's just like, nope. And she straightens her legs and she won't sit down. And I'm just like, no, I don't want to sit. Okay.
Once she becomes mobile, the world changes for you both. So, but it also gets better. So. All right. Well, that will do it for us today. I'm Scott Babcock. He's Daniel Mendonca, and we will talk to you next week.
Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Join the conversation by emailing podcast@haylight.com or on social media platforms at Haylight Inc. And be sure to check us out on the web at www.haylight.com. That's HALIGHT.com.